Hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final lecture for chapter 12. In this lecture, we're actually going to split between two different areas of Asia. We're going to look at the two sets of kingdoms. We're going to look at kingdoms that developed in Southeast Asia, and then we're going to look at some kingdoms that developed in Korea. The main picture you see here is Angkor Wat. That's going to be developed during the rule of the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, in what is present-day Cambodia. You can actually go to Angkor Wat today. It's a very, very, very beautiful, giant complex that's still there. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to look at geography again. Just like we talked about with Japan last time, geography of Southeast Asia is very important to understand here. Really, there's two parts, Southeast Asia is split up into two parts that you need to consider. There's the part that we call Indochina, which is the area that borders China and India, hence the name. So think of like Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Okay, and then you have the islands. So you have the main islands there, like mostly Indonesia today, like Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and so forth. So geographically, or climate, from a climate standpoint, it's very warm and humid. Means the monsoonal rains that are going, or monsoonal winds are going across this area. There's a lot of rain for significant portions of the year. Typically, geographically, it's rivers and valleys that are intersected by mountains, as you can see in the top picture. So it means there's very difficult communication, both in terms of just moving from one area to the other, but also it's going to be one of the reasons why you have a number of cultures, a number of empires, kingdoms that develop in that are pretty close to each other but don't have much contact, and so forth. Now, trade. Trade is going to be a very important part to this region, not just for the people that live there, but also because of the people that live on each side of the trading areas, the trading basins. East Asia, so China and Japan, and then the Indian Ocean trade is Southeast Asia, the Strait of Malacca and the Sunda Strait. They're right in the middle, and you can't go from one side to the other without passing between these two straits. So they're the link between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. They're going to play a huge role in history and still play a huge role today in terms of trade. All right, so just to kind of reiterate, I'll kind of circle around the area that I'm talking about here. So here's your main area of Indochina, or the first section that we're talking about in terms of Southeast Asia, Indochina, and then you have your islands here, okay? All right, and then just to kind of reiterate the straits, this is the Strait of Malacca, okay, where Singapore's at the end of it here, and then you have the Sunda Strait down here. Okay, so controlling of trade, you have to go, if you want to go from here to here or here to here, you have to go through really these two straits. All right, very, very influential places to hold moving forward. All right, so influences for Indochina. The name suggests not only is it between India and China, but also you're going to be influenced by both of those groups. You have big civilization in India, you have big civilization in China. So let's talk about Indian first. So about the 1st century AD, you start seeing Indian trading ships arrive into the Indo-Chinese area. And with them, they bring all sorts of things. Obviously, trade goods, they bring in cultural traits and ways of life. In particular, you see missionaries of the Hindu and Buddhist faith coming into the region and spreading it. So the reason why much of this area today in Indochina are Hindu and Buddhist is because of the Indian missionaries coming in this connection with India. And these kingdoms start to be modeled after Indian politics, because India is going to be the dominant power in this region, or dominant power to connect with this region, and just kind of how we talked about in the last section with Japan kind of starting to model off of the Chinese. The Indo-Chinese cultures here do the same thing, but with the Indians. Okay, and we can see this today in terms of, like we've already mentioned, the religion. You can see it in terms of the languages. If you look at the languages that are spoken there, you can see very a lot of similarities, and then really you see it in art, particularly because art is a lot of Indian art, a lot of Indo-Chinese art is very religious in nature, focusing on the Hindu and Buddhist principles. All right, now the Chinese influences. China is going to influence Southeast Asia through migration, in direct contact, because various dynasties in Chinese history will come to control this area directly or indirectly, and then also through trade. So there's going to be a varying number of political influences, but basically that overland route, that overland connection that China is going to have with Southeast Asia is going to, or Indochina, is going to allow for the influences to come directly in. All right, now the first group that we're going to talk about today here in Southeast Asia is the Khmer Empire. I already mentioned them with Angkor Wat, but it's modern day Cambodia. This empire was established in the 800s. So think about the exact same, kind of around the same time as, as the Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire are at its height under him. Now, the Khmer Empire is able to grow pretty much through the same reason for why the Tang and Song dynasties were able to take off in China, through improved rice cultivation and irrigation. They were able to develop a stronger agricultural system based on these advancements, and you can have more people. When you have more food, it allows you to kind of diversify and so forth and specialize in different things, and they're able to grow. Their capital city is Angkor. There's going to be a huge city / temple complex that's going to be built there. We have a number of the ruins. Angkor Wat is going to be a religious complex that's part of that, that's going to be dedicated to the Hindu god of Vishnu. And we still have huge amounts of this city that still exists to this day. Here are some further pictures of Angkor Wat. You saw this picture on the very first slide, but just look at how massive this complex is. That is known as Angkor Wat. And we'll watch a couple videos that actually go through and kind of tour this place, as well as discuss how it was built on this area, because of it's really built on a very marshy, wet land that it should sink. But the video will actually explain how, from an engineering standpoint, they're able to construct such a large complex on such a marshy, wet area, as you can see. All right, so this is the Khmer Empire at its height, this reddish area here, with Angkor being here. Now we're going to talk about a couple of other empires, the Srivijayan we'll talk about a little bit here moving forward, as well as these two Vietnamese kingdoms moving forward as well. All right, so let's move on to the Srivijayan Empire. The Srivijayan Empire pretty much comes under or starts on the island of Java, and then moves from there. It expands from its power base in Java. There's actually we'll look at a picture of the Temple of Borobudur that they build there on the island of Java. On the island of Java. But the reason why this is important not only is because it's a beautiful building and it still stands, but it shows the influence that we're talking about from India. Those missionaries coming in establishing religion in this area, Hindu or Buddhist. Now, really, the reason why the Srivijaya Empire takes off is because they rule the Strait of Malacca and they control these islands. They are able to tax the trade that's moving through, whether it's the Strait of Malacca or the Sunda Strait. And their wealth solely comes through taxing. And their capital becomes not only an economic hub, but it becomes really a religious hub for Buddhist missionaries and for the Buddhist faith to expand in this region. All right, here's the Temple of Borobudur. Again, we'll actually watch another little video on this that kind of goes through this complex, explains it, shows you off what it looks like in a much better quality here, just as like we will do with Angkor Wat. All right, on to our next culture here in Southeast Asia is the Dai Viet. It's located on the coast south of China, really present-day Vietnam. Really, it was located typically really in the north part. So what happens is in the early 900s, they're able to break away the Vietnamese people are able to break away from the Tang Dynasty because the Tang Dynasty is starting to weaken for a variety of reasons. So in 939, the Dai Viet are able to establish an independent kingdom. And because of their influences and for centuries of the people living in this area, and then because of the being under control for a significant period of time by the Chinese, the Dai Viet have a mixture of Chinese and Vietnamese culture. So how does this work? Well, essentially their government and religion are developed and come from China. So they're Buddhist. They got Buddhism from China. Their government they just take the government system that the Chinese had because it worked. It worked, and especially for them, they're smaller. It can work for them a little bit easier. And then from a Vietnamese standpoint, one of the things they bring to the table that's a little bit different than what you see in China is that women have much more freedom in the Dai Viet kingdom. Now, there's going to be a dynasty that's going to take hold in this area. It's going to be known as the Lee Dynasty. They move the power base in Dai Viet to Hanoi. Very important city for them. It's still a very important city to this day, and they're going to focus on a few things: trade, because they're located on the Gulf of Tonkin in the South China Sea. Agriculture is going to be a big deal, specifically in the realm of rice to feed their people, and then a strong central rule to control this area because there's a lot of river valleys and mountains. They need to have strong central rule to control this area here. And you can see, just look at the geography of kind of the mountainous terrain along the coast here in Vietnam. All right, now we're going to move on to our second region here in this lecture and finish off. For this whole chapter, really, we're going to look at Korea. So we're going to go from Southeast Asia to kind of Northeast Asia with looking at the Korean Peninsula. Now, again, we have to understand the geography of Korea to understand the development of its history. Korea is a peninsula, and it's located between the mainland of Asia. It's off the mainland of Asia there, really China, and then it's pointing towards Japan. So it's going to be sandwiched between, and still to this day, two giant powers in China and Japan. The summers there are hot, the winters are cold. Okay, it's a very mountainous area, which means you have limited areas for agriculture. Okay, now the mountains are a benefit and can be a benefit for a time in that it provides a barrier between the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria, which is northern China. So that can help them, okay, but it also can hurt them because the mountains, as well as the peninsula itself, the sea, can isolate them. So there's going to be some benefits and some disadvantages at various points in history for what the geography brings to Korea. All right, so culturally, Korea is a combination of its own traditions and then that of Chinese traditions, because China is going to come to rule this peninsula for various periods of time in history, so they adapt Chinese traditions moving forward. Early on, just like we talked about in Japan, Korea is controlled by various clans. However, in 108 BC, the Han are able to take control over the Korean Peninsula. They introduced their centralized form of government. They introduced this Confucianism. They introduced Buddhism, and then the system of writing. So when you look at Korean writing, again, why does it look similar to Chinese? It's because of this adoption of Chinese traditions in this through Han leadership or Han control. Now, there's going to be three kingdoms that are going to develop in Korea. You can see them on the map there in the bottom right-hand corner. The Silla are going to be the one that are going to become the dominant kingdom, and then eventually drive the Chinese out as the Han lose control. And the Silla are going to develop their own writing system that's going to be linked closely to that of what they see with China, and they're actually going to develop their own art is actually going to take place or kind of balloon up during this period, specifically that of sculptures. All right, so perhaps the most important dynasty that we're going to talk about here in Korea is the Koryu Dynasty. The Koryu Dynasty comes to control pretty much the entirety of the Korean Peninsula and what we consider Korea today, with North and South Korea, as you can see there on the map. Now, Won Khan is the one that begins the Koryu Dynasty. He's the king. They have a centralized system of government, and they use the civil service system that was used under the Chinese. If you guys don't remember, the civil service system is through a system of tests in your merit. You actually can progress through and gain higher positions in society or in government. Their society is a divided society, a class-based society. You have a landed aristocracy, so the people that actually own the land, and then you have everybody else. And those are developed. Everybody else is kind of divided into their own based on, like, if they're a merchant, artisan, farmer, so forth. You can, even though they have the civil service system, the best positions do become hereditary, so they kind of have a mixture based on merit and based on hereditary positions. They do very well because they control the entirety of the peninsula. You see beautiful jade pottery, as you can see here, that's developed. Art flourishes in the Koryu Dynasty in Korea. You do see printing take off. They use the Buddhist through Buddhist connections and so forth. They develop printing and using that form of blocks, that movable type that we talked about in the Tang and Song Dynasty lecture. Now, Korea is going to go back and forth under their own control, and then being either directly controlled or having to face tributes from other cultures. And in particular, from 1231 to really the 1360s, when they're under the control of Mongol occupation, they have to pay crushing tributes. And the reason why it started on this slide is that's a test question. You guys need to remember that. Why do the Koryu Dynasty, or what is the effect of the Mongol rule on the Koryu Dynasty? They have to pay crushing tributes. And you see this actually throughout history of Korea. They're crushed between whoever controls China, like in this instance, the Mongols or the Chinese themselves, and then later on in the history of Japan. So the Koryu are going to be overthrown by the Choson in 1392. The Choson are going to take control. This dynasty is going to last for over 500 years until the Japanese ultimately take control. They issue land reforms and kind of reorganize the structure of society and centralization of the government, and they last for quite some time. We won't go into that. That's for another course and another time. But that's really all I've got for you with Korea. And remember, with them, just remember they do develop their own culture, their own control, but ultimately they're at a whim for a large amount of their history on who's really controlling China, and then who's really controlling Japan. So that's all I got for you in this lecture. Just a reminder for Chapter 12 as a whole, please make sure that you go back through these lectures, review your notes, and take a look at all this stuff before the test. I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter, and we'll come back to a lot of these different cultures in this region of the world when we look at Chapter 19 and talk a little bit about it more in advance, what was going on with many of these cultures throughout Chapter 12 in their history moving forward. All right, guys, have a good one.